Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Hidden Wisdom. I'm so excited to share Michelle with you. I love her book that we're going to be talking about, and it will absolutely shift the way that you think about the scriptures and about priesthood and priestesshood. So, very excited for our conversation. Before that, I just wanted to give a reminder if you haven't signed up for the app waitlist, I encourage you to do so. We currently have people beta testing the app. And we are set to have a launch on March 24th. So we're coming up here really quickly. One person who's been testing the app has said that this is going to be my new addiction. I can't tell you how thankful I am for what you're doing. This is exactly what I need according to the desires of my heart. So I am confident that there are things in this app that will help you in your spiritual journey as well. So go to meghanfarner.com/app. Sign up for the waitlist. We'll be sending out updates and information as we get closer. And with that said, I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to Hidden Wisdom. Hidden Wisdom exists to initiate truth seekers into the mysteries, gently guiding them toward a lived experience of the divine that awakens and transforms faith without dismantling family or community. This work is about faith renovation and expansion, learning how to inhabit your spiritual foundation more fully, allowing for depth, relationship, and wisdom to grow over time. I'm your host, Meghan Farner. Here we explore Christ-centered esotericism, spiritual discernment, embodied wisdom, and the path of initiation, so your faith can mature, deepen, and become more alive. If you're seeking more and wanting to grow with care and integrity, you are in the right place. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Hidden Wisdom. I'm so grateful to be joined today by Michelle Wiener. Dr. Michelle Wiener earned her PhD in comparative Christian theology through Euclid University in November 2019. She is a graduate of Lexington Theological Seminary in Lexington, Kentucky, and the Ecumenical Institute Bossy of the World Council of Churches in Geneva, Switzerland, where she received a Master of Ecumenical Studies through the University of Geneva in 2005. In 2020, she published an article in the Journal of Philosophy, Culture, and Religion entitled Temple Vision as a Catalyst to Theological Convergence, Ecumenical Renewal in a Post-Ecumenical Era. She teaches religion at Rowan Cabarrus Community College and is on the faculty for St. Anthony's House of Liturgical Studies. She is also the author of Return to Mamre, Recovering the Melchizedek Mysteries Beneath the Sacred Groves. And I have just been loving her book. Absolutely fantastic. If you've been in our community for a while, this is going to be on your bookshelf really quickly. I think you can tell from our conversation, you're absolutely going to love it. So, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
For sure. So can you tell us a little bit more about your background and your spiritual journey? I did want to mention, sometimes as an LDS audience, we don't really have a great understanding of other religions and other traditions and scholarly things that exist outside of LDS spaces, but your education and the work that you've done, it's very prestigious. And so I wanted to emphasize that as we're beginning our conversation today, that you are someone who is well researched and studied, who has published scholarly things, who has done a lot of work and study, and all of that set a foundation for, I think, a lot of the beautiful truths that you present in this book. So that being said, can you tell us a little more about yourself?
And it's a very diverse religious background as well. I was raised Southern Baptist. I'm from North Carolina. And so growing up, I did not have the option of even believing in Heavenly Mother. There was no understanding of the divine feminine. There was no goddess. But there was only the patriarchal God. There was only Father God. And within the Baptist construct, Jesus and God were basically the same. And so if you believed in Jesus, then, you would pray to Jesus and with the understanding that was also God, because there was a strong belief in the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost are one. So it was, and that question always came up in my mind. Well, when Jesus was on the cross, was he praying to himself, my God, why have you forsaken me? Something about that just did not resonate with me. And also that question where it says that in order to be saved, which in the Baptist faith, salvation was essential. You had to know that you were saved, and that was something personally I struggled with. But I was always, I remember as a child calling up, and I was, I was very young. I don't remember the exact age, maybe 7 or 8. And I remember calling the pastor in tears saying, well, it says that we have to believe that God raised Jesus from the dead, but Jesus is God. Did he raise himself? How am I to understand this? And so even as a child, I was very plagued by these questions about the Trinity, questions about how Jesus and God relate to each other. Again, keeping in mind there was no divine feminine to speak of. It was just strictly patriarchal. And so, a lot of those questions were in, they were there from a young age, and I was plagued by them. So, and also this belief too that with Jesus being equated with God, there was always this fear, especially as I got into my teens, of the second coming and what all of that could mean. And of course, I was raised with premillennial dispensationalism with, you think about Left Behind and the Left Behind series. And so all of a sudden, Jesus being equated with God became very scary. And so there was a lot of fear-based theology there, and fear of not being saved, fear of being left behind. And so you can see that was the foundation of my belief system from a young age. Mm-hmm. And this led me to further questioning. I also went to Christian school. I even attended a independent Baptist school for 3 years, that was the most horrible experience of my life. Mm-hmm. And so because of the strict understanding, mm-hmm. and no mercy, there was just no mercy in that belief system. So all of this led to me feeling a need to study theology to try to figure things out for myself. And when I decided to major in religious studies, it wasn't necessarily to become a pastor or anything like that. It was more searching for answers. Mm-hmm. And that journey led to some extraordinary places, and that I never would have thought would have been possible, but I know that was God's plan. So, mm-hmm. or even, I just know that was meant to be. So mm-hmm. that's just a little bit about my background. And
yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about, you went through several faith transitions, and you attended and participated in many different religions, and eventually became Mormon and were baptized. And in your book, you made the comment that one of the reasons that Mormonism resonated with you was kind of the mysterious, mystical, and also experiential aspect. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I always had a desire for the mystical. I believe that, and again, with the denial of the sacred feminine, that was closed off. Mm-hmm. So anything mystical or anything goddess-based was considered pagan, and therefore it was considered evil. And so, all of this was shut off from me. And so, but I had this desire for the mystical and the experiential, and I tried to search for that in my own ways, but it just wasn't there. By the time I got into my seminary studies, which again, I was not studying to be a minister, I pursued a Master of Arts in theology. But even there, because I attended a Disciples of Christ seminary that was liberal and restorationist in its own right, because it's part of the Campbell Stone movement, which is part of the Restoration movement.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was certainly where I encountered some restoration influence. And also this idea of the possibility of there being, although it was not clearly defined, there was the possibility of there being a genderless God. Let's just put it that way, that God was somehow beyond gender. And at this point, I could begin to accept that. I started to think about the possibilities there and what that could mean. But even there, nothing was clearly defined.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember my first time, my first Sunday in church, right before we started seminary classes. I went to church with a friend who was student pastoring, and I remember when they began communion and the communion prayer, which we would call that sacrament in our tradition, but they began the communion prayer, and I remember the person who was giving the prayer saying Father, Mother, God, and addressing God as Father, Mother. And that just left an impact. I found it a little confusing at the time, but it left an impact on me.
Mm-hmm.
And just that, and I was just grateful for that openness that I found in my seminary, just that freedom to be open to the possibility of the sacred feminine.
Beautiful. So when you encountered Mormonism in a more, personal way, when it became, because I'm sure you were aware of it, obviously, through your studies,
Yes, I
but
was.
when it became more relevant to you, did you already know that the divine feminine was an important aspect of our doctrine, or was that,
Not right away. No, I did not.
how did that come up for you? Because that's not usually, it's not an emphasized doctrine at all. So how did that get communicated to you in a way that made you want to pursue being a Mormon?
I don't believe that had any influence on me joining the church. I just realized my cosmology was going in a very different direction. I realized that early on. And I remember we had a professor that asked us to take, at the time, it was a belief net test, and I believe it was belief net, and to try to determine where our true beliefs were, kind of as a diagnostic tool to determine kind of what we really believed. And my results actually came up Mormon. And then second to that was Judaism, and my husband is Jewish.
Okay, perfect. Thank
So
you.
I was already going in that direction.
The reason that I ask is just because, well, first off, the doctrine of Heavenly Mother is something that is often underemphasized, or maybe just not even known in a lot of our circles, even people who have been members their whole lives. I think it's becoming more of a forefront thing for people to know about. But we really don't understand the roots that we have going back to Joseph Smith of the doctrine of a divine feminine, of a goddess, of a Heavenly Mother. And I think in my studies and in my spiritual journey, I've come to see that that is actually one of the most important things that we have to offer a broader Christian conversation, because Western Christianity doesn't hold space for the goddess, but this is a very real and true thing. And so it puts Mormonism in a position to be a bridge and to do that work of circumscribing all truth, that we have something that makes room, even if it's just kind of placeholder. We haven't really filled in institutionally a lot of the gaps there. But have you noticed that? And how did that, when you did become aware of that doctrine, how did that resonate with you?
It resonated with me, but I had to define it for myself. And being a trained theologian, I think I accomplished that. It took a long time. It was not overnight. It was a very lengthy process and even through my doctoral studies, that was where I more carefully redefined and refined what I believed about her.
That's great. And I actually really love that answer. Thank you for sharing that, because I do
Mhm.
think that the experience, the divine feminine is meant to be embodied, right? She's meant to
Mhm.
be experiential. And so I love that for you, it was much more than someone just saying, oh, we believe in a Heavenly Mother, and accepting that. I think that's a true pattern for all of us, that when we encounter this doctrine, it invites us into study, it invites us into exploration and pursuit of her. It's kind of that whole principle of you have to seek in order to find. I think that that is greatly applicable to wisdom and to the
Mhm.
divine feminine. So,
And that is
um,
what Jesus said, to seek and find, seek and you shall
yes,
find.
yes, absolutely. Okay, well, for today, I wanted to just highlight some of the themes from your book. Again, this book is called Return to Mamre, Recovering the Melchizedek Mysteries Beneath the Sacred Groves. And we wanted to have this conversation shared, particularly this week, as some people are studying in Genesis, where a lot of these accounts are written. So first, I'd invite you to just kind of share a little bit about Abraham and Sarah and Mamre and what took place there. I would say that in terms of kind of common knowledge, Mamre and the particular events of that place are not near the top with what we tend to know about Abraham and Sarah. So if you could give us a little bit of this background, that would be helpful.
Well, Abraham and Sarah ended up at Mamre through a long, long, arduous journey that included leaving Sumeria, Ur of, he was from Ur of Chaldea, which was Sumeria, anciently speaking. And from there, he takes the journey and he goes into Egypt. And from there, that's where he acquires Hagar as his, as well, became Sarah's servant officially. And then from there, they went through a series of they ended up in Canaan, and there and through a series of, you could say, trials and tribulations, they ended up in this place, this sacred grove, if you will. It was a place of oak and terebinth trees in Hebron that was called Mamre, and this was after a period of where Abraham had, and everybody's familiar with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, when Lot was captured, and then Abraham had to, he had to try to rescue Lot, and on well, several different occasions that happened, but the first time around, and there he encounters, after a battle, he encounters Melchizedek, and then he gives a tithe to Melchizedek, and through that process, covenants and promises are exchanged, and Abraham is promised things that he has no idea how they will even happen, because he's promised a posterity and he has no children with Sarah. So, and then he's promised that his descendants will number as the stars in the heaven. Well, what's that? How is that even possible, given that
Mhm.
they don't even have a child together? So it almost seems like empty promises were given. And on multiple occasions, there were these different, what we could consider, he would build an altar, and you could assume, well, yes, Melchizedek is absent, but I have to wonder, was Melchizedek really there all along,
Mm.
initiating these oaths and covenants? And so you see this consistent pattern. But what's interesting about this is Sarah is never mentioned as being there in those particular stories where Abraham is offering sacrifices. But yet she is mentioned to Abraham in those encounters. And so my book goes into some level, well, a lot of speculation about what might have actually happened. Was Sarah really there? Was she being, was she also receiving a type of initiation alongside of
Yeah.
Abraham, or was Abraham just receiving this for her? I don't know if you've ever asked that question before or not. What were your thoughts as you were reading?
Yeah, I really appreciated the perspectives that you gained, and to me, a lot of it makes sense because you were weaving in a lot of things that I have also been led to as I have studied certain things, right? And so my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but basically what I would present as the thesis of your book is that Abraham and Sarah were initiated into a sacred order, what you call
Yes.
the Mamre Order, which
Mhm.
we also equate to a Melchizedek order, or my friend Gwendolyn Wine uses the word a matrimonial order. And
Yeah.
basically, it's the higher order of capital P priesthood, which is made up
Mhm.
of priesthood and priestesshood.
Yeah,
And
priest and priestesshood together.
yeah,
And it is interesting that when Abraham's name is changed, Sarah's name is also changed. And well, she was originally Sarai, but then she became Sarah, and Abram became Abraham. And also these promises are given to both of them as if they're both there, but again, Sarah doesn't appear to be there. So
right.
you have to wonder, well, what is really going on here? And is this, was that somehow edited out of the scriptures?
Yeah.
Was it redacted?
Which,
I
well,
had to
yeah,
wonder.
it's not far-fetched, right? I know you
Right.
know this from your studies, but just as a little bit of background for people, I did a podcast earlier this year giving some tips for contextualizing the Bible, right? And one of the things that I think it is important for us to know is that what we have today as the Bible, first off, it was originally written thousands of years ago. We don't know the original writers. It was compiled, it was edited, it was curated under a lot of different voices and a lot of different authorities. And it was done oftentimes with political motivations, right? And so when we know that, that's important for us to know because that does introduce strongly the likelihood of patriarchal influences that said we're going to remove the feminine voice, in the same way that the divine goddess was removed from the ancient temple, right?
Mhm.
Swept under the rug, and we're going to pretend that wasn't there. But one of the beautiful things about scripture, and one of the things I appreciate about your book, is that the divine feminine, because she's hidden naturally, it's a little bit hard to identify all the places that she is, right? And so
Yes.
if you read scripture, when you can read it esoterically, when you have eyes to see the symbolism and the archetypes, you can begin to find her again. And that, I feel like, is what you're doing in your book, is you're looking at the symbolism and the archetypes that Sarah and Abraham are living. And from that, you are deducing these different principles of the Mamre Order.
Mhm. Yes. Mhm.
Right.
And so scholars do believe that possibly and there's in the scriptures, it's in Genesis, it does indicate that Abraham and Sarah may have well been half brother and sister. Again, this could be a metaphor, we don't really know, but but what's interesting about that is, if it's true, I mean, even if it's not true that they were half brother and sister and that they had the same father, there is some scholarly speculation that Sarah's mother may have been from Canaan. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and that she may have been a priestess within that Canaanite order, even a priestess of Asherah, the Canaanite goddess Asherah.
Yes.
So if that is the case, then Mamre is really, as a sacred grove, it's really a sacred shrine, and she even had her tent there, which may have very well been the place of her shrine.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Yeah. And I think that this is a really important thing to understand. And again, for context purposes, right? You mentioned earlier that Abraham seems to be a descendant of Sumeria, and
Yes.
this likelihood that Sarah was a foreigner to his culture, but she was from the Canaanite culture. And what's important to know is that both of those cultures had heavy goddess worship influences in a positive way. People, like, sometimes you hear goddess worship and you think evil things. No, I mean that there was a respect for the matriarchal side of things, that there was active priestesshood, there was an honoring of life, right, that comes
Mhm.
when you are worshiping the goddess of life. And if we look at things just historically as well, Sarah and Abraham, I would say, are kind of right on this cusp of time where the world was actively trying to move away from goddess culture, and there was patriarchal influences that
Mhm.
were coming into place. And
Yes.
so they kind of represent this transition period. And you talk a little bit in your book about how, in some cases we could see that as a really big swing of the pendulum, right? We went from lots of
Yes.
goddess worship to absolutely no goddess worship and patriarchal influences. And right in the middle, we have this beautiful moment with Abraham and Sarah encountering Melchizedek. And I love how you also talk about Melchizedek's wife, who I also believe
Mhm.
was very present and active. Um, Encountering them, being initiated by them, and setting up this other system, this other way of being that was defying some of the celestial cultural things that were going on. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
In terms of,
Of their initiation, right? So you mentioned this idea of Sarah
Mhm.
as a priestess,
Yes,
Abraham as a priest, and their interactions with Melchizedek and how do you say it? Melchizedek.
Melchizedek. She's a speculative character, and there was kind of a joke as I was writing the book that I kind of came up with my own Bible character.
Well,
But
it's interesting though, because I have received similar understandings. As I've
yes,
studied, I felt very strongly that Melchizedek was not solely himself, that it was his partnership with his wife that was really the defining characteristic.
yeah, and he was the king and high priest of Salem, and so it may, just like we have in the temple, we have a temple patron and matron. Um, it I almost wonder if that was the way it was set up, to where the queen, I guess in this case, the main, well, we do know, the society was polygamous back then, but it's almost like the primary, the queen would have been, the queen mother rather would have been the high priestess within
Mm,
that culture. So, I almost wonder, she had to be there.
yeah. And if anyone has listened to the ancient tradition, you'll know that that was common, right? For these ancient
Mhm.
civilizations, the roles of king and queen and high priest and high priestess were synonymous with each other,
Mhm.
right? So that only makes sense. So let's talk a little bit more about Sarah as a priestess, right? So this idea that not only was she descended from the Canaanite religion, which had a
Mhm.
strong goddess presence, what other indications are there of her having spiritual authority in and of herself?
I I would say that the moment that they received the mysterious encounter at Mamre, and we do believe historically that they were male visitors. I had asked a rabbi, the rabbi who wrote my foreword.
Mm,
I asked him about that, and he agreed that they were probably male visitors. That the Hebrew does indicate that. So there was no females. That, as far as we know, the three visitors at Mamre were men. We can reasonably assume that. Um, but she did have the unique ability to hear from them, which is a sign of priestesshood, and also the command to bake bread was a priestesshood. When Abraham says bake bread for the visitors, she goes into her tent and she kneads bread, and that was a sacred feminine ritual.
mm,
So it
mhm,
makes you wonder if perhaps her tent was a sacred shrine there among the sacred groves of Mamre,
mm.
and that she may very well have been a high priestess.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that that's always interesting to learn, right? When we
Mhm.
kind of pan out and are able to zoom out and see the greater historical context that bread and also wine, right? Like the
Mhm.
idea of libations, that
Yes.
those were sacramental items, but particularly in worship of the goddess, right? Like that's a big paradigm shift from what we typically know. Can you
Yes.
talk a little? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and water libations were practiced in the temple of King
Mm,
Solomon. So that's another aspect of that we tend to forget. And when we take sacrament in in church, in our sacrament meetings, we drink water instead of wine, and so I have to wonder if that is a reference to is it a sacred feminine reference? I hope I don't get in trouble for saying that.
Oh, that's beautiful. Oh, well, it's thought provoking, right? That's our goal, is just to give you some things to chew on and talk to God about. But yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. And we know that there were priestess roles that were had in the temple, right? We know this even from the story of Mary, the mother of Christ, she was a weaver and she wove the veil of the temple,
Of the
right?
temple,
It
yes.
was not exclusively a patriarchal run institution anciently.
Yeah.
So we're seeing Sarah and Abraham in this role of partnership, priest and high priestess, as well as
Yes.
prophet and prophetess. There was much more collaboration and co-creation, I believe, in those roles than we are typically aware of.
And then being promised being promised a posterity, a righteous posterity, in spite of not having children, it makes you wonder, is that where the prophetic role comes in?
Yeah, spiritual children, right? Like the idea of being a spiritual father and mother. Well, and also even just that term of her barrenness, there are scholars who look at the stories of Sarah and Mary and Rachel, and it's like all of these women were barren, really.
They
And
were, yes.
there are some scholars who suggest that that word barrenness has more to do with the term virgin, which had less to do with not having sex and more to do with a sacred purity that would be associated with things like being a priestess.
It's a type of consecration.
Yes. So like their wombs were consecrated to spiritual creation before the physical. And that might be why they don't have children until later on, when they're more spiritually progressed and their creation that was previously spiritual transitions now into more of a physical co-creative process with their husbands.
And on a personal note, I have struggled with that because I do not have any children. So
That's so hard, right? And the idea of being a mother, but you lay out so beautifully how being a mother is a spiritual role first and foremost. And we as women are invited to pursue the symbols and the archetypes of a mother, even over and beyond having children, right? So your book is an example of you being a mother, in that you are
thank
offering
you.
this teaching and wisdom.
Yeah, and it's, and it was and certainly I wouldn't say it was a labor of love, because it was a difficult process to write this book. I'm not going to get into those stories, but it was.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
We appreciate your sacrifice.
Thank you. Yeah. I did run into some challenges.
Yeah. Well, another thing that I'd love to talk about that you bring out beautifully in the book, again, helping us have context for this conversation of where Sarah and Abraham were in time, what it was that they were being invited into, the pattern they were establishing, and also some of the challenges around that. And you track how those challenges have been inherited by the Abrahamic faiths, right? By Christianity, by Islam, and also by Judaism. And
Yes.
it's part of why there's so much division, is honestly because we've lost the matrimonial order, the matriarchal thread of priestesshood. And you do a great job of laying that out. But one theme that you identify as foundational to ending this conflict is kind of this debate between monotheism and polytheism.
Yes.
And you offer a great option C that deeply resonates with me. So can you talk about that a little bit, and how we kind of get caught in this idea of the nature of God? Is it polytheistic? Is it monotheistic? And what the truth might be that is actually very liberating and freeing.
Well, in traditional monotheism, there is this belief that there is only one God. Judaism, and I'll just go ahead and, the Shema, where it says Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. And right there, where it's this Deuteronomy 6:8, where it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one alone," and Echad means one. And so, but that's been interpreted traditionally as, or in most people's understandings, as there's just one God. And so is this just some male god sitting on a throne? Islam would have, Islam has a belief in what's called absolute monotheism. But even there's a unity, essential unity within God. So, and then they have 99 different names for God. So, but it is, it is interesting when you look in the just in the Hebrew scriptures at God is not there. There's more there than what we acknowledge. Mm-hmm. There's different names for God, and even you could even do a study on that of the different names of God. So right there you have, these questions being raised as to what exactly one alone, Echad, actually means. And then when you factor in that God created humanity, male and female, in the image of God, created God them, created, they were created in God's image. Male and female, then you have to wonder, well, what does that say for God's image if we as women are also image bearers? Mm-hmm. And I think it all comes back to that word Echad, which means one, but one unified. Mm-hmm. And then when you begin to look at for instance, in Psalm 82, it talks about the council of the gods, and even the council of the gods being judged by God. And so you have to start to wonder, well, what is this divine council? And is this possibly something more than just there being a single male god on a throne somewhere in heaven? Perhaps this is referring to a divine family that was somehow revealed to Abraham, because he did receive that revelation of a new God, that he heard a voice and then he followed, and he didn't know where he was going, but I'm just going to follow this and see what happens. And I'm of the belief that he was not being introduced so much to a new God, but perhaps him and Sarah together were being introduced to a new pantheon of gods that was different from Abraham's Sumerian origins and Sarah's Canaanite origins. This was a whole new pantheon that they were beginning to accept and learn about. Mm-hmm. And even, when you get into the Hebrew scriptures, you see that God has different personalities, different names, different manifestations, angelic encounters, and you have to wonder. And then the three visitors at Mamre, why three? Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's so much more going on here.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciated the language that you put to this in your book, and particularly using the term henotheism, right?
Yes.
And when you said it, I was like, oh yeah, that's me. But I hadn't had that word given before. But the idea of henotheism basically is the idea that there are a variety of gods, but that I worship this one particular most high God.
Most High God. I like to say Most High God and Most High Goddess. Yes, because exactly. They are one.
The Most High God and the Most High Goddess.
One. Yes.
And in my experience and my studies, I've come to see, I think that that's very true, that there's actually a broad spectrum of gods and lots of different personalities that are worshipped across the board. And I don't even necessarily mean in other religions, but as you mentioned in the Bible, there's a lot of different voices speaking in the Bible.
A lot of different voices, yes.
Some of them more benevolent than others, right? And so it's incumbent upon us to do our own discerning to decide, is this the voice of the Most High God and Goddess? Because they are one, as you said. I think
we're told to discern the spirits.
Yes. And that is so important. Two other thoughts on that. One aspect of why I think this conversation is so important is that, especially as people are expanding from kind of traditional religious Christianity thought into broader perspectives, sometimes we are introduced to this idea that actually there is no individual, that it's all just one, right? And that personality kind of gets dissolved the more that you ascend. And that's kind of a very Buddhist idea. Maybe we see that a
Yes.
little bit more in Eastern spirituality. And what I would suggest, and I think that this beautifully represents this idea, is that duality and non-duality actually coexist simultaneously.
Yes.
That there is, I would say, probably the non-duality is the umbrella, because it can hold space for the duality. Another way of saying this is that the feminine holds space for the masculine, in the same way that a mother can bear both masculine and feminine children, or male and female children. And so this is important for us to recognize, I think, especially, with our Latter-day Saint upbringing. I think Joseph would have totally agreed with this perspective, that there are many different beings that are godly, including all of us, as children of God, but that we choose to intentionally worship the Most High God and Goddess.
Yeah.
One last thought I wanted to share, and maybe you can add some more on this as well, but you mentioned just briefly right now, and also in your book, that the ancient pattern of things was a father, a mother, a son, and a daughter as a God family. Can you talk about that?
Well, we have, I would call it a divine pairing, and we've already mentioned that there is Father God, Mother Goddess, and I'm not uncomfortable using that word goddess. I know you said you.
I like it.
I like it too. But with that would come priesthood and priestesshood, and so and then that continuation through the children of the God and Goddess pair.
Yeah.
So it's a continuation, and certainly that's acknowledged within Mormonism.
Yes.
Of posterity taking on the when after the older couple passes away, then the new couple steps up.
Right. And there's many archetypes that kind of support that, some of which you talk about in your book. But I was really excited to hear that, first off, because I recognize, again, from my studies, especially in ancient cultures, I think of ancient Egypt, the Godhead was a family, and it was a father, a mother, a son, and a daughter. And I especially just invite people to hold space maybe for that daughter idea. That's probably the least comfortable piece of that puzzle. The divine feminine half certainly is more foreign, but the daughter piece is a bigger thing to contemplate. And I would also say that if we are holding space for the divine feminine, we need to be careful to not do what was done in Abraham and Sarah's time, which is a conflation of all the gods, right?
Yes.
So it becomes very easy to say, oh, if this thing has feminine characteristics, all of it is Heavenly Mother. And it's a little bit harder to hold space and say, maybe some of this is Heavenly Mother, and maybe there are other divine feminine beings that also have a piece of this puzzle.
And with that deity conflation, what often got ancient Israel into trouble was and you see this in the book of Judges. I mean, as soon as they step into Canaan, they get themselves into all kinds of trouble. And I think that they spent that time in the desert to get prepared so that they would become aware, hey, we don't want to let this happen. Because I'm sure it happened in Egypt too, because they had been exposed to many different gods and goddesses. So, but the moment that they weren't able to grow crops or whatever, and then they looked over at their neighbor and said, well, they're having a prosperous year. Let's try, let's pray to their gods and see if they'll help, because our God doesn't seem to be helping. But, I think what got them into trouble was seeing the parallels among the various gods and goddesses. Okay, well, they have a god for the harvest, and they have a god for this and a god for that. And we also have our pantheon. Well, maybe these gods are really the same. Maybe they're working on the same team. And then, come to find out they're not. So
hence discernment, right?
Yeah. And I think Michael Heiser, I believe did you mention him in your book? I can't remember.
I don't know. I don't think so.
I don't know that you did, but I mentioned him in my book. And so Michael Heiser spoke of Deuteronomy 32:8, where, there's this idea of the the Elohim, or different nations being allotted to different Elohim, kind of this partitioning of gods. And so each nation has its own set of gods, and this ties in with what my book, when it delves into astrology, which we'll get to, we'll talk about that and how archetypes tie in with that. But this allotment of gods, and there was kind of this idea that this pantheon was that Abraham and his family was especially chosen for a specific pantheon. They were given over to this pantheon, whereas other nations were given over to their own pantheons. And those lines were not to cross.
Right.
And again, that's what got Israel into trouble, was worshiping these other deities, thinking, well, okay, so, we have El Shaddai. Let's just use the feminine name for mother goddess here. And well, maybe she's the same as Asherah, who was Canaanite.
And I would say that the conflation of the goddesses, that was particularly problematic, I think, just because the feminine is so much more nuanced, right? And there are so many expressions of her. And so it would be harder to be discerning. Yes. I think it would be easier for something to slip through that is not innately the Most High goddess, right? And so I think that that's what happened. You talk about Jeremiah.
And the Queen of Heaven, yes.
And the Queen of Heaven, and there's a condemnation saying you're baking cakes for the Queen of Heaven. And it's like, well, the Queen of Heaven obviously exists. She is equal to the Most High God, right? The Most High God and the Most High Goddess. The Most High God is not displeased, in my experience, at all when we know her and love her. So what was taking place? Well, maybe there had been a conflation where the Queen of Heaven is kind of a generic term, and there had been an adoption of principles of another goddess that was not the Most High goddess.
Yeah, in this case, it would have been Asherah, because I'm of the belief that the Hebrew goddess is El Shaddai, and that name does have feminine characteristics, definitely. So,
and again, it might be likely too that all of these names, maybe the name is not the best identifier, right? I think we've got to get a little bit more granular and say, what is the characteristic that we're looking at, right? Because Asherah, I mean, that has to do with the sacred groves, that has to do with the trees, it has to do with the menorah, right? Like these were all symbols of her. And so you can't just take Asherah and throw her out the window. You have to get more granular and say, okay, what are the pieces of Asherah that do represent the Most High goddess, and what are some practices that maybe do not? Right.
Although the Asherah could have been a generic reference.
Right, exactly.
Just a Canaanite name for goddess, like any goddess. Right. Like we would say goddess. Well, there's lots of them,
There's lots of goddesses, right? And so you've got to get a little bit more granular, a little bit more specific. And this is why that aspect of discernment is so important. I feel to share this. I've thought of it a couple of times, but I just want to say that in my spiritual journey, again, I have really come to resonate with this henotheistic idea. And it's okay if it doesn't resonate with you. Maybe just put it on a shelf and God will bring it down when you're ready for it to look at it. And it's okay if you get a different answer. But for me, this really resonates. And I've had experiences with God and even with Christ, who is a part of this, of the Most High God family, right? Where he has asked me, do you still want me to be your God? Or do you want someone else to be your God? And that was asked with zero judgment or shame or anything. And it was genuinely an option for me to say, you know what, maybe I want to go and check out this Greek pantheon or the Hebrew or the Hindu pantheon of gods, And in my case, I just love Jesus and I love the Most High God and the Most High Goddess. And so, but that was a conscious choice for me to make, to say, you are my God and my goddess. I know there are options. And that's actually a really empowering thing, to choose into worship in that way, especially when you don't have to. So anyway, that was just an experience that I felt to share.
And there is an understanding even in scripture of that we have that choice. And other people have that choice as well. They can choose to, to believe in our God and goddess or not.
Right.
So,
And again, it doesn't mean that just because there's a most high God and goddess, it doesn't mean that everyone else is horrible. I think that there are helpful things to gain from all of these places, right? And the most high God and goddess to me represent the culmination of all of the best, truest things. So that's why I choose them. Okay. So one of the things that, well, do we want to go astrology or do we want to go priestesshood? Where do you want to, let's go astrology. Okay.
go into
So
astrology. I think we're on that wavelength. So
I know, I love it.
we're moving
So
in.
can you tell us a little bit about the importance of symbolism and archetype when we are trying to unearth the feminine side of the equation, the priestesshood side of the equation? Why are those things important? And how do they connect to astrology?
Well, I think that I think we have to begin by defining archetype, and it's possible that I don't know how much the viewership would know about that term, because I think we were kind of when we were discussing this on the phone last night, we were kind of just throwing around this term as if we understood what it meant, and I don't think that that's probably as well defined for others. So I think we need to define that first.
Yep, go for it.
Okay. So, an archetype is a type or example, or we could even say a template or even a mold. We talk about not fitting specific molds, and as women in the church, some do and some don't, and those of us that don't, are kind of like, okay, well, I don't really fit this mold, but it's still, it's still there, and it's a standard. We might even say cookie cutter. That's kind of what an archetype is. It's like something you either fit or you don't. And I think that when we talk about astrology and the constellations are a perfect example of archetypes. And much of when you study ancient cultures, from all different perspectives, what you realize is world mythologies tend to fit into these archetypes, which are mirrored in the sky with, the stars, the astrology, the constellations, the movement of the planets, even. And ancient mythology just simply told these stories, and then they would use the language of the gods to try, gods and heroes, to try to explain what was happening, how they understood what was happening in the sky. So, I mean, that's the basis for world mythology.
Yeah. And I think that we can trace these things back to a singular source, right? Like that hidden wisdom that pre-exists all the different religions and mythologies and cultures that have descended from it. Another way that I might describe the archetypes is that these are members of the pantheon that we're discussing,
Yes,
right? That these
and
are
they're
aspects
embodied in the constellations, in the heavens.
Yes.
I mean, even the planets, if you think about it, Venus and Mars were named after gods, or maybe the gods were named after the planets. I'm not sure which way it worked, but even there you had they believed that these were living beings, not only the planets but the constellations, as they would look at the various patterns and try to interpret them. It was a scroll or a book even, of what was actually happening. It's kind of this understanding of on earth as it is in heaven. And so everything that was happening here on earth reflected the story in the heavens. And the Hebrews had their own. A lot of people are taught that, well, astrology is evil, it's bad. A lot of Christians don't want anything to do with it, but the Hebrews had their own version of astrology called the Maseroth. And a lot of people are not aware of that, but that's where I derive some of my theories about the possible pantheon and goddesses that are embodied there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And this should really make sense when we're, again, looking at the context of Abraham and Sarah and contemplating what was the order that was established with them truly. is to understand that astrology would tie into that makes perfect sense, as Abraham is considered the father of modern astrology. We
And
read it even.
he was told to look to the heavens.
Exactly. We read it in the book of Abraham, where he was taught about the cosmos. He was taught about the stars and the sun and the moon and all these things. And so we can only deduce that that would have included astrology and seeing these patterns in the sky. The value of the patterns being this very thing that we're talking about, that when we understand them and embody them, we gain access to knowledge and power that would otherwise not be available to us, right? Including knowledge of priestesshood.
Yes.
So do you want to talk about some of the archetypes that you have found in astrology that kind of mirror priestesshood and the progression of women?
Well, and I outlined this in my book that I found 4 goddess archetypes in astrology, and they're all in similar sections of the sky. I might not explain this very well, but because my sense of direction is not the best, I'll just go ahead and say that. But I was able to identify 4 goddess archetypes that exist in astrology. And with this, I have to preface this, and I do say this in my book, that that I do use Greek names because those are the ones that are most familiar. But I realized that the Hebrews probably had their own names for them.
Yeah,
And
probably every culture, right?
Yeah, and
Saw the same thing and named it
some of
differently.
that has been lost, which is sad. I will say that I conducted extensive research on this, and there was just not a lot to be found. So I worked primarily with Bullinger, with his writings, which was, that's a little bit older, different time period. But he had done a lot of research on the Maseroth and looked at it more from an evangelical perspective. So, from a Christian perspective, definitely. So a lot of his understanding of these various archetypes are based off of his understanding of the Christian gospel. Yeah, which works well for our purposes, but it doesn't work well from a Hebraic perspective because we don't know really what they were called. What Abraham and Sarah might have called them. We don't know. And so a lot of this from that angle is speculative, and it just has to be because, I'm hoping somebody will maybe someday read my book and then find additional documents or work that's been done on this, because the information is just not available. So a lot of what I'm working with here is speculative, and then again working off of the Greek names because that's all we know. And you do have parallel names in other cultures, but these are the ones we're most familiar with. And so, I look primarily at, you have the maiden, mother, and crone archetypes in goddess worship. And so this is embodied in Virgo, Coma, and Cassiopeia. And then you mentioned the daughter, that may very well be embodied in Andromeda. And and I did find some interesting things about that she may be connected with daughter Zion.
Yeah, we can go there if you want to, but I just wanted to say that first off, astrology is such a deeply feminine language, and it is ancient, right? And so I appreciated that you went there. And then also looking at archetypes, that was something that I felt led to in my book on my chapter on priestesshood. Was one of the most fun chapters to write because it was just received. Like I just felt like it was given to me, and it was given to me also in the language of archetypes, which I would not have cognitively thought about. But I just want to say that I think that this is where we see the patterns of the priestesshood. It's written in the stars, it's written in our bodies, it's written in fairy tales, right? And
absolutely.
The invitation is for us to identify where am I at in my story, and how do I better inhabit the archetype that I'm being invited into right now.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You mentioned fairy tales, and I mean, the fairy godmother is that's the glaring example.
Exactly. Well, and there's always, there's so many different themes you can look at, but so many fairy tales are reflections of Mary Magdalene. And I like how you draw out some of those comparisons and talked about her in your book as well. But I would just say that if anyone is interested in understanding more about priestesshood and what priestesshood looks like, the patterns are there. They're written in the stars. And even our modern astrology, the 12 signs that we have of the zodiac, while I know that there are associations of this one is masculine, this one is feminine, the truth is that I see the feminine in all of them, right? And probably the masculine is there too. All the best things are balanced. And so you can look at those as a pattern to say, okay, what is the feminine archetype that I'm being invited into that's written in the stars?
Yeah.
Do we want to talk about the mother-daughter thing
Sure.
and that pattern as well?
Yes.
So this was kind of an aha moment for me as I was reading your book, and particularly early on when you were talking a little bit about the relationship between Sarah and Hagar. And this has a little bit to do with patterns that I've seen elsewhere. One example of this pattern could also be the idea of a sacrifice and a scapegoat. So on Yom Kippur and the Day of Atonement, the ancient Hebrew tradition was that they would have one animal that was offered as a sacrifice. They had another animal upon whom they would spiritually place all the sins of the people, and then they would send it out into the wilderness. So you have these two aspects of something that are both taking place at the same time. And what I have found in studying the divine feminine is that this is also a repeating theme that we see, particularly with women and with feminine archetypes, is you have one aspect that's kind of this mother role, like you could associate it with Mary, the virgin mother idea, this pure prophetess type. And then you have what I would call a daughter figure, and she is always labeled as a harlot. She is cast off. She is seen as evil. And she's kind of the scapegoat personality. And so that was really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about how Sarah and Hagar maybe fit that role? And then also Cassiopeia and Andromeda.
Yeah, there's it's an interesting relationship between Sarah and Hagar, because Sarah, if you recall from the story, Sarah actually gives Hagar to Abraham to essentially marry. I mean, you could say that Hagar was also one of his wives, and that could be interpreted in a number of ways. But they're certainly, she was given to Abraham to bear his child, thinking that might be the covenant child. And then later it was determined, well, no, he's not. But there does seem to be that foreign and kind of that native and foreign understanding of with Sarah being at least partially indigenous to Canaan, and then and then maybe even related to Abraham, and then Hagar being the Egyptian.
Yeah, this was another layer of it too, right? Is that the mother? So we're talking about two archetypes, and this is helpful because oftentimes when you're reading the Bible, you come across either these virgin mother types or these harlot daughter types. And what we can come to understand is that they're really meant to be the same thing. And one way you can think about this is the virgin mother is this aspect of our soul that is already exalted, right? That exists outside of time, that is our truest self. And the idea of the harlot daughter is the part of our soul that's here, that's experiencing a natural self that is encased in flesh, right? And so the idea is that the mother and the daughter are to be reunited, and to create wholeness between them.
Although Sarah was not Hagar's mother, well, I guess she, there was not a mother-daughter relationship there. But
I would say it's more of a symbolic, spiritual mother-daughter relationship. So another example we could look at is Mary and Mary Magdalene, right? So Mary Magdalene was told she was said to be a harlot. She really wasn't, though, right? In the same way that we're we're told that we're horrible sinners. Really, we're not. We're in a state of learning right now, in a state of growth. And who we really are is that exalted being. And so Mary was native to the land. Mary Magdalene was a foreigner. Like, you can just kind of see this pattern anywhere.
Ruth and Naomi.
Ruth and Naomi is another one.
She was Moabite and Naomi was Hebrew.
Yeah, exactly. And so I just present that as a theme to look for. If you're seeing these two recurring types of divine feminine, it's meant to be teaching you something about, about ourselves, right? And also about the priestesshood and kind of that coming full cycle and everything coming together.
And even with the story of the astrological story of Andromeda and Cassiopeia, Andromeda was the chained woman, and then Cassiopeia was the enthroned woman. And the idea is that Cassiopeia Andromeda becomes freed by Perseus, and then later she is enthroned. So she essentially becomes Cassiopeia, and they're one and the same. And even, you have that same dynamic going on with Virgo and Coma in the other constellations, where when you really look at them, there's the possibility that they may be the same person, just at different stages in life. And this is something that's important with the sacred feminine being understood in terms of lunar energy. And then because you talk about, the three, the archetype of the triple goddess and those different stages, the different phases of the moon. So all of this is embodied, it's all connected. And even the pattern of Venus, and Venus is connected with goddess worship. But there's kind of this light and dark pattern in the orbit that Venus follows. So, all of this is connected. And then when you look at the male archetypes, they reflect solar energy. So it's the order of and the different levels of glory, even between the sun, the moon, and then I think the highest is the stars, but the 3 degrees of glory.
Beautiful.
So it's, it's kind of like, okay, the solar masculine energy is too bright. But then the lunar energy is too dim. And so really what you need is the two to complement one another. And how do you do that? You look up to the stars for answers. And so the Mamre Order is the order of the stars. It's the order of Melchizedek.
That's really beautiful. And I like that reversal of the symbolism from what we typically think of, because the stars it's also the symbol of progression, right? Of infinite creation, as well as the divine spark that exists in each of us, that we are all stars, right? And coming into that unity within ourselves is the fullest expression.
And we're all the descendants of Abraham. So he was told to look up to the stars.
Yeah. That's really good. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Well, we're going, this is fun. This is a fun conversation. If only for you and me. I'm having fun.
Me too.
Before we close, I wanted to talk a little bit about just the implications of this, right? So going back to your overall thesis, that is that Sarah and Abraham were establishing the Mamre Order, which is based on, a pantheon of gods, but understanding I worship the Most High God and Goddess. It's based on being initiated in the mysteries and cultivating partnership between the masculine and feminine. Sarah serving as queen and high priestess, and Abraham serving as the high priest and king. And that there are a lot of mystical elements that come into that, including the study of astrology and seeing these archetypes in the sky that we're being invited into. I really appreciated in your book, first off, one thought that really came to me along the idea of being a peacemaker is, and seeing so much of the division in our world. To me, part of the answer that you offer is that we need to remember who our mother is.
Exactly.
That we are all the same mother, and the healing that she has to offer. You liken the symbology of a shadow in a positive way, right? That like when it's hot and you're in the middle of a desert, you want a tree and you want to rest in the shade of the tree. That's a refuge, right? Which that word refuge is also highly symbolic of her. And so I appreciated that. And then obviously the biggest key to that is we have to recreate that equality with women,
Mm-hmm.
between and men.
Between men and women, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. And not at the expense of men, right? Because men have had a lot of power for a long time. I think equality sounds like a loss of power to them rather than what I think it would really be, which would be a balancing and expansion of both sides of the equation.
Yeah.
Is that when the feminine is respected, she pours her life into those around her.
Yeah.
First and foremost, her husband, right? So do you have any just final thoughts, anything that you would like to share in terms of embodying priestesshood and reclaiming that lineage of the divine feminine so that we can experience healing?
I do believe that, one of the other themes that comes up in my book is that of reconciling the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which are incredibly divided, as we know. And there's never been, I was mentioning, being a peacemaker, and we've tried, there's been efforts, whether it's through interfaith dialogue or just trying to, peace treaties. We've tried everything. Um, and I think that, what you said about maybe the key to peace and reconciliation among the Abrahamic faiths is to invite in the sacred feminine, because that whole aspect of our faith, which it's there from the time of Abraham, but that whole aspect of our faith is closed off because of the monotheistic, our skewed understanding of what monotheism really means.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I like how you quoted in there just the feminine imagery that Christ used that I think also is deeply applicable to the feminine, which is that she desires to gather us as a mother hen
As a
gathers
mother hen gathers her. Yeah. And I love that image because in my family we used to raise parakeets, and so it makes me think of that.
Yeah, it's
Mhm.
resonant. Well, Michelle, thank you so much. Thank you for this fun conversation. Again, her book is Return to Mamre, Recovering the Melchizedek Mysteries Beneath the Sacred Groves, those sacred groves being so beautifully, divinely feminine. I'm, again, really grateful for just some of the layers of truth that I think are here, even for people who have studied this topic for a while. You bring out some really interesting themes that I think are expansive and important for us to consider. Again, I love just the way that you tie in the most feminine things, and inviting us into healing through partnership, healing through priestesshood, the power of the priestesshood, exercising that in connection with the power of the priesthood. So it's beautiful. Everyone go check it out. You can find it on Amazon. And Michelle, thank you so much.
Thank you.